All right, guys. So today we are going to start talking about cellular transport. So you're going to need two sheets out of your handouts. Your first one, you're going to need your cellular transport introduction sheet, and then you're going to need your passive transport sheet. So we're going to fill out all of the first one and part of that second one. So, the first thing we're going to talk about for our introduction sheet is the cell membrane. And we're specifically going to start with the structure of the cell membrane. So, we learned what the cell membrane did, which we're going to review in just a second when we talked about organelles, but we didn't really talk about the structure very much. So, first of all cells have a cell membrane. So, it doesn't matter if it's a prokaryotic cell or a eukaryotic cell or plant or animal or bacterial. Every single type of cell has a cell membrane, okay? It's kind of like the skin of the cell. It needs it there to be able to function. The outer layers of the cell membrane is called a phospholipid bilayer. So that means it's made out of fats, which are the lipid part, and phosphate molecules. And then it's a bilayer because it has two layers. So bi means two. So if you see right here in this little picture, we have two layers. So this top layer right here and this bottom layer. So that makes it a bilayer, a double layer. And this bilayer is made out of two layers of lipid molecules. So we have the hydrophilic heads, which are the white golf ball looking things, and they're hydrophilic, which means that they're water loving. Okay, so that means that water will easily pass through in and out of the cell through those hydrophilic heads. However, the tails on our phospholipid bilayer are hydrophobic, which means they're water fearing, and that's the part that's made out of fats. So if you've ever mixed like oil and water together, you see that they separate. So that's why they say they're water fearing, is because those fats kind of repel the water. So we have a hydrophilic head and then two layers of hydrophobic tails and then another hydrophilic head. So the way that this is made up, it is going to let water in, but these hydrophobic tails are going to help regulate the amount of water that comes in and out. And sometimes these work great and sometimes they don't work great. And we're going to talk about that tomorrow when that bilayer doesn't always work properly. And it can be very, very bad. So we want to make sure that we do have very happy cells and that our phospholipid bilayer is working properly. One last thing about the structure of the cell membrane is that there are proteins that are embedded into the membrane, and these proteins are there to help communicate with the outside of the cell and with the inside, and to be able to transport things in and out of the cell. So sometimes things are just too big to just go through the cell membrane, so they need a little help. So we have these proteins that are inside the membrane that can act as like a hallway or maybe even like a little doorway that opens and closes to let certain things in and certain things not. And so, like certain molecules have certain proteins, it's like a key. And so, they only fit that certain protein to get in and out of the cell. So, it's very important that we have those in our cells so that we can get all of the nutrients and stuff that our cells need to function. All right, next we're going to review over our functions of our cell membrane. So before we learned that it helps regulate things coming in and out of the cell. So it helps separate the cell from its environment, and it acts as a gatekeeper for the cell. And it does this by being semi-permeable. This is just a really long term for saying that it's kind of choosy. It chooses what can come in and it chooses what can go out. So if it doesn't like whatever that molecule is, it doesn't need it, then it says, hold up, you can't come in, okay? Or maybe it says, we need you a lot, and so you definitely can't leave the cell. So it's very important that we have that semi-permeability for our cell membranes. This also helps maintain homeostasis. So if you think back a couple units ago, we talked about homeostasis and how our bodies have an internal balance. So we have a certain amount of heartbeats that we have to have per minute, and we have a certain temperature that our body's supposed to maintain. We're supposed to have so much water per day, and our blood pressure is supposed to be a certain number. That is homeostasis. And so, like when we get sick, we get a fever. And that fever is trying to kill something that's inside of our bodies that's going to hurt us. So that fever is trying to bring us back to a healthy state, an internal balance, that homeostasis. So that's what our cell membrane does for each and every single cell. It helps it to stay healthy and hopefully not let anything bad in. Although this does happen, right? Because that's what's happening right now with coronavirus. It can enter into our cells and it copies and copies and copies and copies and copies. And then that's how we get super sick, right? Because sometimes our cell membranes don't recognize things that they've never seen before. And that's how we get things like a pandemic, is because our bodies have never seen them and they don't know how to deal with it. They think that it's just something normal. Or sometimes the bacteria or the virus might pretend to be something else that our cells do need. And so it confuses our cells. But that was besides the point. So we're trying to maintain homeostasis, and that's what our cell membrane does. And it also provides protection and support for the cell, just like our skin does for our body. All right, so at the very bottom of your sheet, you have a T chart. On the left side, there's active cellular transport, and on the right side, we have passive cellular transport. So we're going to go back and forth and see how these compare. This is our overview so that when we go in depth on each one, you kind of know what we're talking about already. Okay, so for active cellular transport, this is using energy to get things in and out of the cell. So something might be so big that we can't just bring it into the cell. So we need energy, we need that ATP to bring things into the cell. And we're going to talk about that even more next week when we talk about photosynthesis and cellular respiration and how our bodies make energy. On the other side, on passive cellular transport, the cell does not use energy. So these are things that can just go through the membrane without using energy. And it's important that we have both types of these transports, because if we just had active, then we would completely use up all of our energy just trying to get things in and out of the cell. So we need that passive cellular transport so that things can come in and out without just wasting energy, right? But we also, on the other side, need that active transport to make sure that we're getting those bigger things in and out of the cell. Okay. Now, for active cellular transport, we're moving from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. And it's the opposite for passive cellular transport. So we're going from high to low. So a good example of high to low concentration would be if I were to stand in the corner of the room and I had air freshener and I just kept spraying it on my corner of the room. Now, obviously, I can smell it right away because I'm the one that's spraying it. It's all right there around me. But say Miss Brown is on the other side of the room. She may not be able to smell it right away because she's on the side of the room that has a low concentration. But that concentration is going to move toward her and it's going to even out inside the room. So it's going to go from high concentration to low concentration. Okay. But our active goes the opposite way. In our active cellular transport, we have two types of transport. We have endocytosis and exocytosis. And then we have three types of passive transport, which are diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and osmosis. And we're going to talk about all five of those in depth, starting with passive transport. So now we're going to move on to our passive transport sheet. So it has diffusion on the left-hand side, and it has osmosis on the right-hand side. So that's the sheet that you need now. We're going to go through diffusion first. So diffusion is our first type of passive transport, so it doesn't need energy to get things in and out of the cell. So this is the transport of small particles from high concentration to low concentration. So when we're talking about particles, we're talking about like oxygen and carbon dioxide, something that is not like a liquid, right? Particles are going to be very important to make our cells run properly. And like I said before, when I said that I was in the corner of the room spraying that spray and it would even out through the rest of the room, that's called equilibrium. And that's what's happening in diffusion. So we're going from our area of high concentration to low concentration so that it equals out on each side. Okay. So we want to make sure that for our cells to function, if we need oxygen in our cells and there's a whole bunch on the outside of our cells, that we're going to diffuse that oxygen into the cell so that it's equal on either side. Okay. And that's the same thing with our diffusion from inside to outside. So if we have more inside of the cell than outside, then we need to get some out. Then we're going to move it out of the cell until it's equal on both sides. And you can kind of see that in this picture right here. So we have a ton right here on the outside of the cell and none on the inside. But then as you see, the particles or the little molecules of oxygen are going to start going across the membrane into the cell, and now we have an even amount on both sides. Okay, so that's a good representation of diffusion. All right, next we have facilitated diffusion. And this is just diffusion with a little bit of help. So sometimes we have particles that are just too big to go through the membrane. So this is where those proteins come in that we were talking about. So they create these little proteins. They're called transport proteins because they're transporting things inside and outside the cell. So they just make a little hallway through the cell membrane, and it lets things like glucose or sugar come in and out of the cell. So it's very important because we need sugar for our cells to run. And like I said earlier, these proteins are like a key, or they have specific molecules that go through them. So, say oxygen wanted to come in through this little transport protein, but it was a sugar transport protein, then the oxygen couldn't come in. Only the sugar could come in and out of it. So, it's very important that we have those specific ones so that we know what we need to come in and out so that we don't get too much of something inside the cell or too much of something outside the cell and make us sick. All right, our last type of passive transport is osmosis, and this is where we're going to stop today, okay? Because we're actually going to perform an experiment with osmosis and some gummy bears, okay? So, osmosis is the diffusion of water molecules from high concentration to low concentration. So, that's the difference between diffusion and osmosis. Diffusion is moving particles like oxygen and sugar, and osmosis is always water. Water is a thing that's moving across the membrane. But it's the exact same thing. We're moving until it's equal on both sides. So as you can see in our little beaker, we have a same amount of water on both sides, but we have way more particles on one side than we do on the other. So our water is going to move across the membrane so that it evens out more. So we have, like I said, fewer particles on this side, more particles on this side. So we need our water to move across so that it evens out our concentration. So we have that semi-permeable membrane, and you can see in the second picture that our water has moved across so that those concentrations are now even. It looks kind of like they're not even because there's less water, less molecules on this side, but we're looking at trying to even them out in ratio. So our ratio of water to molecules is even on this side, and our ratio to water and molecules is even on this side. So that's what we talk about when we reach equilibrium. It can kind of be a little bit confusing. But that's the end of our notes for today, and we'll finish our osmosis notes tomorrow.